The door to the ancient tomb creaks open. Ahead of you is the inky black darkness of a space that has seen no light in thousands of years. As you cautiously step forward, wondering what lies ahead. We have dark vision! Guys, we've been over this. Every time you say, we have dark vision, I add another skeleton to the encounter. That's how it works. Today we're going to discuss describing the environment for our players and how we can use that narratively on this episode of The Local Disaster Tour Guide. Hello travelers and tourists, my name is Mark and I am the Local Disaster Tour Guide. That's right, I am a storyteller who is about to bring back your favorite game from childhood, The Floor is Lava. Make a reflex save. Welcome to a journey through the fantastic world of TTRPGs like Pathfinder and Starfinder. Today we are continuing my Storytelling in Pathfinder 2e series, a series where we're taking a look at the advice, the tips, the tricks that Paizo offers game masters to help us as we run Pathfinder 2nd Edition at our gaming tables. This series is intended for game masters of every skill level from beginner to advanced, and even if Pathfinder 2nd Edition isn't necessarily your favorite game, I have found that studying a multitude of games helps us to learn new tactics that we can bring back and apply to our favorite games. So regardless of what game you play or how long you've been storytelling, I invite you to be a part of this conversation. Today, we are continuing our conversation on exploration mode. We have been talking about the different modes of play in Pathfinder 2nd Edition, encounter mode, exploration mode, and downtime mode, and most recently we've started working on exploration mode, that intermediary mode between the tension of encounter mode and the rapid progress associated with downtime mode. It is a mode of play that exists, according to our previous video, to reward our players for learning about their environment, and that brings us very neatly to today's topic, the environment. And I'm going to go ahead and say that today's topic is going to be part one of a small series discussing the environment. Today we are effectively discussing terrain, which is one part of the environment that we need to describe for our players and use to relay important information to our players. And I'll go ahead and say that terrain can actually get really complicated, so for this video we're going to be sticking to the standard types of terrain that might be featured in an adventure, and in a future video I plan to dive in to the subject of planar terrain, which is its own crazy side concept. But today we're looking at one of the building blocks of the environment that our players need to explore, and that is the terrain. By the way, some quick references if you're looking at reading up on the stuff that we're talking about today. From the Pathfinder 2nd Edition core rulebook, we're going to be taking a look at pages 475 to 476, which is going to cover some tactical definitions of terrain, such as difficult terrain, greater difficult terrain, or uneven ground. And then we're going to look in the core rulebook from pages 512 to 517 to talk about different types of terrain, such as aquatic, arctic, desert, or underground. Additionally, if you're looking for some good suggestions for how to describe different types of environments, check out page 18 of the Game Master Guide for Pathfinder 2e, where they have it's a sidebar, but it's kind of so large it takes up most of the page. But they have a sidebar, technically, that offers some advice and some suggestions of different ways you can describe certain types of environments. Also, I should note that in today's video, I'm going to be referencing a couple of tables from the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, and they are in one of the sections that I mentioned earlier. They can be found on pages 512 and 513. So again, if you are looking for any of the specific content that I talk about in this video, that's where you can go to read up on these things for yourself. And one last note before we dive into today's topic, which is, don't forget about my completely pointless internet challenge, which is, right now, RPG Superstar 2021 is having the public voting round for the monsters that have been submitted to that competition. There are 412 different monsters that have been submitted, and you have until January 25th to go in and give feedback and vote on the different monsters that have been submitted. I submitted 3 monsters to that competition, and since I don't want to spoil the voting, I'm not going to say which monsters I submitted until after the public voting round, but I have dropped a pointless internet challenge. Anyone who wants to score some pointless internet points, throw your prediction for which 3 monsters you think were mine in the comments section of this video or any of my videos, and after public voting ends, I will be giving a shout out to anyone who got the answers correct. By the way, bonus points if you can figure out which of my 3 monsters were submitted by Mrs. Local Disaster Tour Guide. Alright, with that out of the way, let's get started. As a game master, you want to be familiar with some of the different ways that terrain can be categorized, which can be found on pages 475 to 476 of the core rulebook. This includes difficult terrain, greater difficult terrain, hazardous terrain, uneven ground, narrow surfaces, and inclines. Difficult terrain and greater difficult terrain represent areas of terrain that are more difficult to move through, and as such, when a player moves into that type of terrain, they must spend additional movement in order to do so. So, if they want to move into difficult terrain, it costs an additional 5 feet of movement per square, and if they want to move into greater difficult terrain, it costs an additional 10 feet of movement per square. Difficult terrain and greater difficult terrain are kind of subject to game master interpretation. For example, if you think of areas with lots of standing water, terrain that would be considered difficult terrain for a medium-sized creature might actually be considered greater difficult terrain for a small-sized creature just because of the amount of water relative to the creature moving through it. So for these types of terrain, be aware that game master judgment calls will sometimes be necessary. Hazardous terrain refers to any kind of terrain that has the potential to damage a player when they move through or interact with that terrain. And this can be everything from the classic rocks fall, everyone dies, falling boulders, to the floor is literally lava, to thorn bushes or other forms of dangerous terrain that players might move through. Often these types of terrain will come with various skill checks that a player needs to perform in order to safely navigate that space. Uneven ground and narrow surfaces both refer to types of terrain where players will need to attempt to balance when they pass through the terrain, or they run the risk of falling prone, or in the case of narrow surfaces, maybe even falling off of whatever surface they happen to be traversing. Finally, you have inclines, which refer to segments of terrain that are so steep that a character can't just normally walk up them, but must attempt to actually climb up that particular terrain, and again, they run the risk of falling if they fail their skill check. Any and all of these descriptors can apply to terrain from any potential environment. You can find uneven terrain in an Arctic environment or a desert environment. You can certainly find inclines in the mountains, but also potentially underground. So, as a game master, you want to familiarize yourself with these categories of terrain so that when they come up in particular environments, you know how to educate the rules for that particular type of travel through that particular terrain. When it comes to hazardous terrain in particular, there are 2 very helpful tables that you will want to refer to. One is table 1011 and the other is table 1012, which can be found on pages 512 and 513 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. Table 1011 is just a hazardous terrain damage table. It's a quick, easy reference to the amount of damage that might be caused from minor, moderate, major, or massive hazardous terrain damage. Again, you can see here that when it comes to environmental rules, that there is a level of game master judgment call that has to be made, as to whether a particular form of hazardous terrain would qualify as minor or moderate or major, what have you. But the core rulebook, and thankfully the Game Master screens, do give us Table 1011 as a quick reference guide, so that if we need to make that judgment call, we can do so quickly and be reasonably within the bounds of what the game expects. Table 1012 is not available on the Game Master screens, although it is one that you might want to have as a handy reference or keep bookmarked. And this is an environmental features table that offers a skill check range and a damage category for different types of environmental features, such as an avalanche or a blizzard. Again, it's kind of a quick, rough reference tool, but as a game master, if you need to make a judgment call, you can do so very quickly and effectively using that table, so it's definitely one you want to be familiar with. After you take some time to become familiar with these rules for types of terrain, with these rules for hazardous terrain, you're ready to move on to the actual different types of environment that are discussed in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. But there is one quick element that I want to throw in here before we dive into those environments, and that is the concept of landmarks. Most human beings navigate through the use of landmarks. Even though I know my address, when I am driving home, I'm not paying attention to street signs, but rather I'm looking for familiar buildings or other landmarks that I can quickly and easily use to find my way home. Most people navigate by paying attention to the environment around them and using landmarks as a point of reference. So when you are describing environments, regardless of aquatic or desert or forest or whatever it may be, one thing you want to be mindful of as a storyteller is to think, what kind of landmarks can I add to this environment that my players might be using as a point of reference? And quick cheat on adding some narrative purpose to exploration mode, landmarks often make for some great minor story hooks that you can use in your game. For example, the Lonely Mountain in The Hobbit is a major landmark that also has a pretty significant narrative purpose. You can often line these two elements up and use them very effectively together. But now we come to the environments themselves. As a game master, when you are planning out your session, one of the things you need to think about is the environment that your players will actually be in. I know this seems pretty simple, but it's one of those things that you can overlook in the rush of trying to get a game together. I, as a storyteller, have certainly been guilty of forgetting to consider the environment where I was getting ready to run a game. A classic example that I'm sure many game masters have messed up is forgetting to reference the swimming rules before running an aquatic or semi-aquatic adventure. If you have a significant amount of water in your game, it benefits you as a game master to review the rules for swimming and moving through water before actually running that session, because there's a very real chance that your players are going to be using those rules. So as a game master, one of the things you want to do is think about the environment you're going to use and think about what rule sets will naturally come up during the game, and make sure that you're taking the time to refresh your memory on those rules before the game begins. And speaking of my swimming example, let's talk about the very first environment that's discussed in the Pathfinder core rulebook, which is Aquatic Environments. All of the environments that we are discussing today can be found from pages 512 to 517 of the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook. In describing aquatic adventures, Paizo notes a couple of things that game masters should be aware of. One of them is the rules on swimming, and another is the concept of how are your players going to breathe. These are things that you want to think about when you are prepping the adventure. Do your players naturally have access to things like the water breathing spell? If not, have you provided some way for them to access the water breathing spell during the adventure? If you haven't, there's a very real chance that your players are not going to be able to access all of the content you have prepared. By the same token, since a lot of movement is going to involve swimming, you want to be aware of the rules for swimming so that you don't have to spend time at the gaming table searching up those particular rules. You'll just have that information ready to go. Now, Paizo doesn't mention this, but this is actually a concept that you will probably want to think about when it comes to running aquatic adventures, and that is the concept of visibility. Anytime you have moving water, there is a very real chance that that water is going to be stirring up debris. And if the water is stirring up debris, that means that if your players are in that water, and especially if they are under that water, that visibility is going to be very limited, and you will want to think very carefully about what your players will be aware of, how far they can see, and how well they can detect threats that might be in that environment. Crystal clear water is beautiful, and I have been to some amazing beaches in my life that have that crystal clear view, but be aware that crystal clear water is often the exception, not the rule, and that you may want to consider the restrictions on visibility that will occur if you are running an aquatic adventure. The next environment that they discuss is an Arctic environment. And one of the big things that you want to think about if you're preparing to run a game in an Arctic setting is, well, the concept of heat and cold. Barring some kind of special resistance, there is a very real chance that characters who do not have adequate protection for the weather can die of frostbite. The cold is a very serious threat in an Arctic setting, and you want to make sure that you have prepared yourself for those rules, for those kinds of challenges, and for the very real struggle against snow and ice. Now, I plan to have a separate video in this series on the subject of weather, because weather really is its own topic when we talk about the environment. But even if the snow and the ice isn't in the air and just on the ground, it's still something that your players have to deal with. You're probably going to be looking at athletics or acrobatics checks to cross dangerous, slick terrain that is covered by this snow and ice, and how many rangers have been called in to make the quite difficult track roll after a fugitive's escape trail was covered by a fresh snowfall. As a game master, you want to think about how the cold, about how the snow, the ice, pose unique challenges and threats to your players, and you want to make sure that you've read up on those rules so you're ready to implement them quickly and efficiently. On the opposite extreme, we have desert environments. Hopefully I don't spell this wrong and make you think of red velvet cake. If cold is the threat in the Arctic environment, then heat is the threat in a desert environment. The heat, the sun, the dangerous lack of water. I haven't seen the Dune movie yet, so I can't do any references to that one here, but there is a definite question of moisture anytime your players are going to be trying to move through a desert environment. And as a game master, again, you need to spend some time thinking about how that heat, about how that lack of water is going to affect your players as they attempt to travel through this particular type of terrain. Also, another thing you want to bear in mind when you think about traveling through a desert is that sandy deserts are often difficult to travel through because sand is very difficult to walk across, and traveling through sandy regions might actually slow your party down significantly. As a game master, think ahead of time about these issues and prepare for them to come up in game. The next type of terrain that the core rulebook discusses is forest terrain. And one of the unique elements that comes up in forest terrain is the concept of visibility and cover. Now, the core rulebook specifically notes that trees do not automatically provide cover unless they are large enough to fill an entire 5-foot square on their own. However, smaller trees may still be big enough that a player can use those trees for cover if they use the take cover action. So be aware that even if the location doesn't have massive trees in it, they still might be useful for actions like taking cover, and that is a strategy that both your players and your bandits can employ. But beyond simple topics like cover, one of the questions you need to ask yourself when dealing with forest terrain is the idea of visibility. How far away can your players see and hear what might be ahead of them on the road? Certain terrains, like desert terrain, are often very open and you can see other groups of people from a great distance, but forest terrain is a terrain associated with ambushes because you often cannot see other people until you're right up on them. So as a game master, you want to be reading up on visibility, detection, those kinds of rules, so that you can make good judgment calls about what your players are encountering. Also, forest terrain has a unique potential aspect, and that is that it's one of those types of terrain that lends itself to 3D combat. In other words, you have the forest floor level of the encounter, but you also have the canopy. And there are plenty of monsters and enterprising bandits who can use that extra level of the encounter to their advantage. As a game master, you want to ask yourself, do my monsters operate just at the forest floor, or can I make this a 3D encounter and allow some of them to attack from above? The fifth type of terrain that is discussed in the core rulebook is mountainous terrain. And this is the terrain where the uneven grounds, the narrow surfaces, the inclines, you're probably going to have a lot of those things popping up during play. In fact, climbing and falling are major considerations when exploring the mountains. You have chasms and cliffs and steep inclines and narrow passes. You have a lot of natural terrain features that are going to limit where and how your players can move around the map, and as a game master, you want to familiarize yourself with those restrictions on movement and the options that your players have for getting around those restrictions. Also, while it's certainly not as extreme as most Arctic environments, it is worth noting that very high elevations can also have the same problem with the cold that has been mentioned previously in the discussions of Arctic environments. Now, probably the easiest terrain to run is the sixth type of terrain, which is plains. Visibility is often very high, your players can see for great distances, and if you've ever driven through Kansas, lots of farmland. Lots of open farmland. That's a long drive. Now, plains are good for allowing for very rapid movement for your players, but it also is going to factor in when you're thinking about encounters for your players because of how far away different groups can see one another. It is very easy to detect other groups, and by the same token, it's also very hard to avoid detection. So if your players need to sneak across the open plains, they probably have a significant challenge ahead of them. Another thing to consider is that man-made objects are often going to be very visible from great distances away. Forts, towns, other significant things that people have created, your players are often going to be able to spot them from great distances. Now, there are some natural obstacles that can occur, such as hedges, but that also means that when you're dealing with plains terrain, that you're going to encounter a lot of man-made obstacles as well, such as walls or ditches or other fortifications. Another type of terrain that the book discusses is underground terrain. And quite possibly the biggest consideration here is how often you're going to strangle your players because they won't stop interrupting you by saying, "I have dark vision." Seriously, I know, can I please finish the scene description? Come on, guys. But one of the things that is important when your players are exploring cavernous underground terrain is the concept of light. Do your characters have a light source? How many light sources do they have? And in the absence of those light sources, are there any other natural ways for them to navigate around? I've actually known a few people who go caving for fun, and one of the things that they have described is that running or flowing water in a cave can often be used to help navigate, and that small streams might be a way for players to find their way around a cave if they have no other landmarks to base their journey on. Also, when you're dealing with underground terrain, expect all of the things we discussed for mountains to apply here as well. There is one final type of environmental terrain that has the potential to be the most complex of all, and that is urban terrain. Now, in some ways, urban terrain is actually very conducive to role-playing. You have easy access to NPCs, you have streets and buildings that have been designed for people to use. In many ways, urban locations are ideal, but they also present unique considerations that you might not find in a more natural environment. Remember earlier I talked about how forest terrain has the potential for 3D combat because you have like the forest floor and then anything that might be in the canopies? Well, in urban environments you can really have some fun with a 3D type of map because you have not just the city streets and the rooftops, but you also have the sewers. And the core rulebook actually spends some time talking about basic sewers and advanced sewers that have like worker access features and the possible natural hazard of exploding sewer gases. Yes, Game Masters, you do need to take out some PCs with this at some point. It's just a requirement. One of the great benefits and challenges of an urban environment is the fact that there are so many places a character can go, that a character can hide, and that a character can attempt to conceal something that they don't want somebody to find. As a game master, you really have to think with a three-dimensional mindset of where possible threats could be and where possible rewards could be hiding. And that's to say nothing of the social aspects of exploring an urban environment. Moving through a crowd, dealing with law enforcement, the inevitable run-in with the Thieves Guild. You haven't earned an honest coin a day in your life, have you? Please, Bethesda, don't sue my channel. In an urban setting, you're often dealing with both physical obstacles and social obstacles, which can make the options and challenges for your players a lot more complex. So, as a game master, again, you want to plan ahead and think, what will my players encounter? What will my players experience? What will my monsters or my villains be using in this environment? You want to make sure that you have read up on the appropriate rules and that you have the resources ready to go so that when your players are moving through that environment, you're ready to rule on the things that they're doing very quickly and very efficiently. But those are the 8 standard types of environmental terrain that are discussed in the Pathfinder 2e core rulebook, and some of the things that you want to think about as a storyteller when you are using those types of terrain. Other aspects of the environment, like weather, or other types of terrain like planar terrain, we're going to save those for a separate video. So, let me turn the conversation over to you. When it comes to these types of terrain, is there anything that I left out that as a game master you should be thinking of when you're planning your game sessions? Are there aspects of an aquatic adventure that I failed to mention? Or are there features of the forest that I should have brought to the fore? Yeah, I'm sorry for the alliteration, I couldn't stop myself. Let me know in the comments down below what things a game master needs to prepare for so that they can manage these different types of environments well. If you enjoyed this video, like it and share it, subscribe to the channel. And if you would like to support this channel, check out my free Discord group and my Patreon, which are both linked in the video description down below. Don't forget to go over to RPG Superstar 2021 and vote on the different monsters that are part of the public voting right now. Thank you so much for being here, thank you so much for being a part of the conversation, and have a wonderful day.